Welcome to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine. I interview leaders, experts and business professionals from around the world who are bringing leadership principles and know-how into the digitally driven 21st century workplace, with focus firmly on the how-to rather than the what. Each episode is in aid of a charity chosen by my guests, and since 2020, we've made donations to over 80 global and local causes. My guest to kick off Season 8 has an astonishing story to tell. Serena Palmer is a senior international business leader and highly regarded coach. For much of her career, Serena has led a double life, accentuated by an ADHD diagnosis almost too late in the day. This is Serena's first public discussion, telling her story and highlighting the pressures on many leaders everywhere. Whether this sounds like you, or someone you feel may need some help, this is a must listen. And as a thank you to Serena, we're proud to make this episode in aid of the ADHD UK charity to which we've made a donation. Thanks very much for joining me, Serena. Please introduce yourself, your business and your passions.
Hi, well, great to be here. Thanks, Jeremy. So I'm Serena Palmer. I'm the owner of Serena Consulting, which is an organisation I set up at the beginning of this year, focusing on two key things. So to begin with, strategy one is coaching, but with a bit of a difference. So the coaching that I offer is for executives, is for leaders. It's also offered early careers, which I think in my career history is one of the most significant parts of your career, which is underinvested in terms of coaching. So I offer that. And also one-to-one equity, diversity and inclusion, or EDI coaching, which again is a point of difference in the market because it's not commonly understood that one of the significant shifts in mindset for leaders is to have a safe one-to-one space in order to explore equity, diversity and inclusion issues. And what we've learned is, leaders attending EDI training tend to go a bit quiet. They're either sort of, unless you're at the top 5% and really championing and understanding and role modeling EDI as a leader and really vocal at the top, or what I would also say the bottom 5%, 1 to 5% who are really anti EDI. Most people sit in the middle, and that's where that sort of silent majority end up leaving with lots of questions. And one of the greatest ways to help people understand EDI is, first of all, make it personal, and second, give them a safe environment to do so. So that's one part of my business. The other area is talent strategy, and I'm a bit of a geek in that area. So my career history has taught me a lot about really effective talent plans or talent strategies. I'm absolutely an advocate for keeping it simple. As we'll talk about later, I've had different careers, and I remember very clearly when I was in operations, really resenting HR for sort of layering on lots and lots of people strategies and not knowing which one I'm supposed to be doing. So for me, a really effective talent strategy has EDI built into it. It has a future focus and it's super easy. So I offer talent strategy services. And then I guess as a bit of a sidebar, I also do keynote speaking, team coaching, training, etc.
You do a lot there, Serena. And I completely agree with you around the early careers coaching. That is going to explode, I suspect, over the next year or two, and particularly early careers, whether people are going into the corporate world or whether they want to be their own entrepreneur in the in the open marketplaces that we've got there. And getting to them early means that you can talk about all of those other things, ED&I, talent strategy, their own development. I love that. And so let's talk about how you got there then. What's your career journey? And as you now sort of look to where you are now, why do you feel executive and life coaching are such sort of important levers for leaders and teams these days?
So if I start with the second part, first of all, from my perspective, I trained as an executive coach about 15 years ago, and the jobs that I've had in the sort of HR sphere and talent sphere have enabled me to provide internal executive coaching. So I've been coaching a long time internally. The other side of that coin is I myself have had two amazing coaches in my career. And it's not an exaggeration to say, that they have been transformative. The power of coaching, I think, is sometimes underestimated. And occasionally you find it's still got a bit of a reputation for being very much exclusive to the most senior people in the business. And feeling like a sort of gift that you're given as you, reach the heady heights in a big corporate. When coaching is really effective, when you've got the right coach, it enables you to have an hour or 90 minutes with somebody in a professional environment, utilizing their professional skills to be entirely self-indulgent, and not also being subjected to the views and opinions of your friends or colleagues, which is what happens, right? With everybody's best intentions, you may go to a colleague with an issue and then be inundated with their thoughts, opinions, and views on the world. And that's actually not what you wanted. You wanted to work it out for yourself, or you wanted to maybe just air your views and then take a pause. So what coaching offers is that entirely, and I think it's a great gift, self-indulgent, selfish time, which is so necessary for people to unpick and take some breathing space out of their day-to-day lives. Because we, particularly in the corporate world, we continuously add hours and hours onto our day. We're starting earlier, we're finishing later. Particularly in the UK, we are brilliant at foregoing lunch, breaks, etc. And yet we never get to the end of our to-do list. It doesn't matter how many hours you build in. So in a one-to-one coaching environment, certainly with my clients, and a discipline I've always had, is you never arrive at a coaching appointment having just left a meeting. So you have to build in, ideally, 20, 30 minutes before a coaching session and the same after a coaching session. So that gives you, with permission, that time to really process and take stock of what's going on.
Yeah, and I guess that links closely to how you've benefited from coaching, as you've said, through your career, and how you sort of applied that. And I love the terminology, that breathing space, because that time is that personal currency for performance and growth, and something we just, either don't have or don't think we have, don't build it in deliberately, all of those kind of things.
Yeah.
And it's very clear, because, people will need help through that. We don't know what people are going through outside of their work, in life as well. So it's, that everything's kind of on one here. Yeah. And that leads me to you, actually, and your extraordinary journey, which reinforces some of what you've mentioned there around the importance of having a support network and coaching.
Yeah.
But let me just open this up for you, Serena. Take us back to where your own challenges started and what they were, and the journey from there.
Yeah. So I do a big intake of breath here, because this is a conversation that I've been wanting to have for a long time. So I'm really grateful to be able to do it on this platform. So my career is a little unusual. I've not had a very traditional route. I always talk about, I've had, I guess now, 4 very separate parts to my career. I started early at age 16. I left home and went to London and went to drama school, and embarked on an acting performance career, lived an amazing life. Some of the happiest times in my life, being creative with like-minded individuals and having some relative success in the performance world. From that led me to a full-time job at the London Dungeon. If anybody visited in the sort of early 2000s, it could have been me that was jumping out and scaring you. But, an actor's dream from a perspective of a stable career, it's a job that pays regularly. And that was great. And And I joined just at the time, sort of a year or so into performing there. Merlin Entertainments then embarked on this really sort of big expansion program. They were buying up lots of attractions around the UK and Europe. And it was the first time I heard the word talent outside of a performance arena. So they ran a talent program looking for people to upskill as operations managers. With this new acquisition of lots of different businesses, they needed a whole load of operations managers. And I was asked to do that. And I did. And it turned out I was really good at it. I wouldn't have thought that was necessarily a skill set, but you don't know till you try. And so very quickly, very early in my career, I was given a lot of seniority. I was head of operations for the London Dungeon. I then went up to Edinburgh and helped launch the Edinburgh Dungeon. And from there, I went to the Natural History Museum in South Kensington, London. So a lot of people know that as the Dinosaur Museum. And I was running operations there, several hundred people, and doing a great job at it. And again, coincidentally, one of the things I did in that capacity was design a lot of training and sort of upskilling for my teams. And that caught the attention of a new HR director. And they were opening a new part of HR, which I'd never heard of before. And it was called leadership development. And I was asked, would I like to retrain, reskill? And going back to my earlier comment, I have to say I was deeply offended when I was asked to do that. Because HR was the enemy, as far as I was concerned. As I said, lots of people, processes that got in my way, slowed me down, and none of it seemed to make sense. But what I did love was leadership, and I loved that sort of concept. And I was really lucky. I was given the opportunity to do my CIPD qualifications there. I was invested in a lot in terms of qualifications and certifications and, really kind of upskilling. And I couldn't get enough of it. I'd found something that was so fascinating to me, the psychology of it, how, there were such differences and commonalities, particularly at somewhere like the Natural History Museum. You've got some of the world's leading scientists there. And you've got commercial leaders, very different schools of thought coming together. And I loved it. But I got itchy feet and, the museum wasn't moving at a fast enough pace. And I was like, I've got this passion. I need to go somewhere completely different. That led me off what could be more different than McDonald's. So that's where I went. I went there as one of their first people development managers. From there, I went to the Co-op and specialized in talent. O2, leadership development and talent. And my career in HR was getting I was really honing my skills in talent, leadership, equity, diversity, inclusion, workforce planning, that sort of arena. And it was really what I was living and breathing and ate for breakfast. And I was getting more senior. I was getting a lot of promotions really fast. I think I had 4 or 5 promotions in as many years at O2. And before I knew it, I was working at a really big global corporate as a global director of talent, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I was running a department. I was hiring people around the world, jetting off, absolutely transforming that organization in terms of how, when I first joined, it had no EDI policy, to going from that to something that was really cutting edge in that industry, and success. And it felt so good. However, what had been happening, certainly for, it does shock me even when I say this now, but probably for the last 10 years, is my mental health was really suffering. And I had explored an awful lot of avenues. And if I can be as crass as to quote Kanye West, in one of his songs, he says this amazing phrase, pain ain't cheap. And I think that definitely applies. I was in significant pain. but I didn't recognize that. And what I was doing was I was throwing money at it, and I was going to hypnotherapists, and I was paying a lot of money for private doctors. I was exploring all these different avenues, trying to blame something, trying to find a cause. And it led me down lots of different avenues. I was prescribed SSRI drugs, so for anti-anxiety drugs, and these are so common. GPs, I hate to say it, but they hand them out like nothing. I know so many people who have just been dished out antidepressants and, sertraline, those types of drugs. And I was on those for 5 years, and I knew that they weren't addressing what was really going on. And at the same time, Jeremy, and it sounds nuts now because I'm sitting in a different position, but there was something else at play that I was in deep denial about, and absolutely could not see that I had a significant alcohol issue. And what was going on there for me is my drinking started very early. Like a lot of people in the UK, it's a pretty normal story to be sort of hiding behind a bush in a park about age 13, with a few cans of cider or whatever you've managed to get your hands on. My story was and that's no different. But as I look back now, I noticed that something was already different about me and my relationship with alcohol, even from those very early days. So I had no understanding why, if faced with, let's just say, 3 cans of cider in a park, why somebody would choose not to drink all 3. My attitude was always, well, you drink until it's gone. We had limited resources, but of course you would. And I see that now. And then if I sort of fast forward, what I had always been doing was heavy binge drinking. So I was very much swept up in that culture of going at it hard, whether that's an after work thing. That was very common in my early career. Most evenings, it would be, let's go down the pub. And when I look back at that, I would always leave as the most drunk out of anybody. I would always be the one that had an embarrassment or a incident, or, I'd be the one that everybody would talk about the next day. And I hated it. I hated that. And I used to beg and plead to whoever the higher power was that I could just be a normal drunk. Why can't I just be? And even now, that mindset is already a huge warning sign. I wasn't trying to not drink. I was trying to be as drunk, but not as noticeable. And that tells me a lot. And so over the last sort of 10 years, my drinking was always binge drinking. And so it would normally be a Friday night. Great celebration at the end of the week. It would be at home. I started to stop going out so much, mainly because I had a younger child and, those sorts of things. So drinking at home with my partner on a Friday. And it was often a lot of fun until it wasn't. I would find that I was often still awake and he would have gone to bed. And I'd still be drinking until it was gone. The drink was gone. And then what was to happen the next day is really crushing anxiety. So anxiety has been an issue for me for a long time. I now understand why, and I'll go into that. But the crippling anxiety was, it got to the point in the last few years of my drinking career that I would not wish that on my worst enemy. And it was this sort of bouncing between heavy drinking, crippling anxiety, recovering from that, giving myself a few days and back on it again, back into that cycle. And over time, what I know now is, alcoholism is a progressive illness. It is an illness. That's the first thing to say. It's not a choice. So the tipping point between a heavy drinker and an alcoholic is when alcohol, your alcoholic brain, becomes dominant. And that is when you are now sick, you're ill. And for me, Jeremy, I like to think of my addiction issues and alcohol issues. What helps me is I view it as I have two separate brains. I have my brain and I have my addiction brain. And when the addiction brain is in charge, that's when things are really bad. But I had no idea I was an alcoholic. I thought alcoholics were people who were sleeping rough, drinking cans of Tennent's on a park bench. I thought alcoholics were people with no job, or people who had lost everything, or, that was my view of an alcoholic. I was calling myself an enthusiastic drinker and or sometimes I'd say binge drinker, sometimes heavy drink, but never alcoholic. And my search around my mental health was getting more and more panicked. But not once did I ever talk about to any of these medical professionals drinking, and nobody asked me. You're on mute, I've just noticed. So that's fine. So no one asked. So I never told. And why would you, if you're in the grip of an addiction? And as I became more senior, the pressure on me to perform grew. And this is the same for anybody in their career. And when I think about my career to date and the different things that I've done, what I have become an expert in is honing the most amazing mask. And we talk about mask wearing all the time in corporate world. People sort of chuck it in and throw it away. But I had developed quite the professional mask. And it served me, as I thought, very well for a very long time. I was hiding this other part of my personality and this other part of my life. And it was getting progressively worse. And what started to happen with my drinking, and I always talk about my drinking as catastrophic. And I talk about it as incidents, because I still wasn't one of those drinkers that would get up in the morning and have to, crack open the booze in order to get rid of the hangover. I wasn't doing that. I was sort of going all out and then nothing for a few days and then doing again. And it all sort of culminated in really kind of like catastrophic events. So I was able to, one of my favorite things to do as a drinker was to ring everybody, so I would, manage to ring people. I had people I knew all around the world in the US, brilliant. They're on a different time zone. So it might be 10 o'clock at night for me. They're just finishing work. So I can call them and, talk nonsense. And, I was seeking all the time to talk to people. And that tells me there was a part of me that knew I was really in trouble. But I just couldn't see that I had an addiction issue. And it sounds crazy now. And when I speak to friends and family and close people, they are utterly amazed that I did not know I was an alcoholic. They did, but nobody said it. Nobody's, and I have no, don't misunderstand me. I don't blame anything on anyone. I take full accountability for my own addictions. But I find it curious that their presumption was I knew I was an alcoholic and I was just doing nothing about it. And that simply wasn't the case. And it all came to a head where my drinking was now so excessive, isolated, and terrifying. And I ended up having to get sort of emergency help. And I was now at a point, Jeremy, where there was my addiction brain was fully in charge. And what I know now about an addict brain is it's trying to do a few things. It wants you on your own. It wants to isolate you so that it can allow you or encourage you to continue to drink as much as possible to eventually kill you. And that is what your addict brain is trying to do. and it's really loud. And I had a moment after that situation where there was nothing left. I didn't know how I could now live my life. I didn't know what my life was. It had all coincided with a redundancy, which, that was one thing. My relationship was also at an end, and I'd had the foresight to sort of make that decision. And with no purpose to get up in the morning, and all the chaos of an end of an 18-year relationship, my addiction fully took over, and was, the isolation was so fast, and then the sort of almost dancing with death every time I was drinking, to such an extreme that I just didn't see a way out. And I'm very lucky that, my mum, who'd been saying to me for at least 12 months, I think you need to get some help. But when my addict brain was still fully in charge, my excuses would be, well, how on earth can I, she was trying to get me to go to a rehab. And I was like, well, I can't do that. I've got a busy job. I've got to fly to America. I've got to go and do this. I've got to deliver this, So that was always the reason. But now I had no job. I'd, taken redundancy. There was no big reason for me not to go. And I was at the very lowest that I've ever been. And I said to her, no, you're right. She was like, I think you've run out of options. I agreed. And I said, yeah. And so she said, okay, let's get you into a rehab. And I had just enough of my own brain, not the addict's brain, to be able to say yes. And I have to go now before the addict's brain steps in and finds a way for me not to go. And so that's what I did. And so, I found myself checking into a rehabilitation. It's really quite a terrifying thing to do. I had no idea, only what I'd seen on movies, or, which is, I now know, is really badly represented. So, the Hollywood doesn't do us any favors in terms of how they, demonstrate what rehabs are, because it's very different. But I was really scared. And I was also completely, utterly broken at that point. And I was desperate to put an end to this cycle. And what I haven't mentioned is, in between all of this, a few years when I was 43, 42, so about 4 years ago, I also received a diagnosis of severe ADHD, which is where I'd taken myself to a private psychiatrist. He had diagnosed that. I walked in there convinced I was bipolar. And after that consultation, he said, no, it's not that. There are two things. And one of them I'd like to test you for straight away. So I did the full adult ADHD testing. Turned out I was a 9 out of 9 on all of those, with a supplementary diagnosis of a medical inability to relax, which sounds like a strange thing. But to me, that made a great deal of sense. And my daughter had been diagnosed just a few years before then. And this speaks volumes into the misunderstandings around ADHD, because I tried to learn as much as I possibly could about ADHD for her, and never once applied it to my own self, because, and we laugh about it now, because, she used to say when she was little, oh, I feel a bit different, because I find that I do X or Y. And I'd say, well, no, that's not different, because I did that. And of course, of course I did. And, that diagnosis came and made some sense of my mental health, but it was a little too late. I had already developed over a lifetime a coping mechanism to deal with the symptoms of ADHD that I didn't know I had. And you know what, Jeremy? It turns out this is really common. Over 60% of what we call late diagnosis ADHDers, over 60% have already got an addiction or a substance abuse issue. And that's no surprise, as I now understand ADHD, and have pretty much dedicated the last sort of year to understanding the correlation between ADHD and addiction. Key facts: ADHDers are born with less, we don't have the same level of dopamine. It's not in us. So we're constantly looking for it. So therefore, if we think about the things that give us a hit of dopamine, they're often things that are pretty addictive: smoking, drinking, drugs, food, sugar, all of these types of things. Strangely enough, even things like skin picking becomes addictive, because you shouldn't. And it's that whole weird wiring of the brain that I hadn't understood or knew I had, and I'd been self-medicating for years. And so going to rehab was a transformative experience. I absolutely thank the universe that I was one of the lucky ones. The success rate isn't great. And it really just depends on if you are able to see the truth of what's going on. And the honest thing is, for the first 4 days, my addict brain was fully in charge. And whilst I was, it's a very strict schedule. You get up at a certain time, breakfast, you're watched, you have everything removed from you. So you don't have scissors, you can't have tweezers, you lose all of your privacy, your dignity, your bedrooms are unlocked, you're checked on, all of this kind of stuff. And I was sort of nodding along and going along with it. But for the first 4 days, in moments of pause for me, my addict brain was alive and well and saying, well, you've messed it up big time now, Serena. Now everybody knows, all your family know you've gone to rehab. So what are you going to do? Now you're going to have to hide your drinking. And look what they did. They forced you to, whereas you used to just drink, and not try and hide it. And that was a good thing. Now, look, now you're going to have to go down the woods and drink. Now you're going to have to, get in the car and drive to a field. And that's the conversation that was going on for 4 days. Meanwhile, I'm presenting and nodding. And then came the big shift. And again, I was just so lucky that this happened. It was in a group therapy session. Somebody was talking about all the methods that they had about hiding drink. And, one of them was kind of amazing. Addicts are really clever, by the way. I'll come back to that. We're really, really smart. So this individual was talking about, they were pouring vodka into the iron because their husband would never iron. And what a brilliant place to have it, so it was, and all of this stuff, I was listening to this and, my addict brain fully in charge. This isn't you. You don't do that. You don't put vodka, behind the loo, in the iron, in the bushes, on the dog walk. You're not doing that. And I was sort of like half listening to my addict brain. And then something that I just don't know, something a bit in the middle, my brain suddenly went, liar. You're a liar. Look. And it was like, all I can describe, it was like watching a film in sort of whooshing past me. I was hiding drink, not as extreme as the person with the iron, but I was always calculating how to drink more than other people. And I was always packing booze to go, if I went to go and stay with a friend, I'd bring booze with me, but there would be an extra bottle that I would be drinking without disclosing it. So I present to everyone else with the wine on the table and drinking like they are. Every opportunity I had, I was drinking my secret bottle. I was hiding it. I was. And I was so good at hiding. I was hiding it from myself. I didn't even know, which comes back to when people say, gosh, how did you not know that you were an alcoholic? Well, because addiction is baffling, cunning, and really clever. And it's so clever that it will hide things from you. it will tell you different versions of the truth and minimize. That's what addicts do. They minimize everything. And they try and rewrite history. So, oh no, it didn't happen quite like that. No, I didn't drink that much, and you're gifted at that. But this was taking a real toll on me, Jeremy, because the 2 lives I was living, I was showing up at work. By day, I was a professional executive who was running a big team, who had huge responsibilities, and frankly, doing a pretty good job. By night, I was a catastrophic binge drinker. And after a while of living those 2 different identities, my self-loathing was off the charts. I would only be able to look at myself in the mirror first thing in the morning to put my makeup on. Then I had to walk past like this. I hated everything about my identity. I felt like a fraud on a scale that, people talk about imposter syndrome. I deal with a lot of clients who feel that. Not only did I have imposter syndrome, but I was like reinforcing it. So I was demonstrating, well, just, 5 hours ago, I was collapsed on the floor, passed out at home. And then I've scraped myself together just enough to get onto a Teams call. But I can see out of the corner of my eye the devastation, the things I've broken by accident, the stuff that I've done. But here I am, and it had to stop. And so rehab gave me that gift. And I met amazing people, Jeremy. I'm now talking to you today. I'm in my 8th month of sobriety, and I'm a real baby in terms of recovery world. But I don't remember the last time I did 8 days, in my whole adult life. So 8 months is amazing. And in that 8 months, I've met hundreds of addicts and alcoholics. And I have met people who are extraordinarily successful, who have run or are running huge businesses, who are high-powered executives. I've met people who are entertainers, celebrities, finance executives, lawyers, judges, you name it. Anybody from society. And what I left rehab with was this sort of double whammy. I've always wanted to run my own business. And I realized the only thing that's stopping me was fear. And fear is just your imagination pretending something might happen. And it didn't feel like a good enough reason to not do it. The second thing is I'm compelled, my whole career, what drives me is to help other people succeed. There's nothing I love more, is to unlock those things that hold people back. And then having had my rehab experience and getting sobriety, it was so loud, the voice in my head, I'm now driven by helping expose addiction in the workplace. It feels like one of the last taboos, because if I can't live by the rule of recover loudly so that others don't die quietly, then what am I doing? This experience I've had for a reason. And sometimes you have to go through these things in order to make change. And I now know the gift of my ADHD brain is that I'm really good at making change, and I can use those skills, but I can also use my experience to do that. And, what I can say as a matter of fact today is there is an executive epidemic of addiction at work. The more senior you get, the more at risk you are. We just don't hear about it. What we hear about is so-and-so, it's really strange actually, because we've got to a point, and particularly in big corporate life, we're very comfortable now to talk about depression and anxiety, mental health, well-being. But there's this other bit, which is that people find ways to cope with that. And it's on the rise. It's almost balanced now between men and women. It always used to be more, significantly more men. it's not a surprise because more women, thank goodness, are getting more senior roles. But that also means we're now level pegging in terms of substance abuse, addiction issues in senior roles. And the biggest killer for an addict is shame. That's it. You know, the addiction wants to kill you. And if you have the layer on top of that, which is I'm so ashamed to tell anyone, then you stand no chance of getting help. And what causes shame is stigma. And so that's where I'm coming at this conversation from. I just want to start a different conversation in corporate business world, whatever the industry. We're now looking at roughly, from an executive perspective, roughly 10 to 12% with reported addiction issues. Those are the ones that report it. And what we know is that's probably just a drop in the ocean, right? So that's what's driving me now. And my challenge, I guess, to the corporate world and to people watching or listening to this interview, if you're in a position of power in a business, if you're a decision maker or a leader, are you brave enough to be the one that says, you know, maybe it's a conference, maybe it's a team event, I'm going to bring somebody in who's going to talk about addiction and its correlation to stress and seniority and pressure. A lot of people want to do it, but the one who wants to do it is afraid to even say, I would like to book an addiction guest speaker or someone, in case people think that they're an addict. And so it's this self-fulfilling prophecy. And, you know, when you think about people at whatever stage of addiction they're at, if they're already on that pathway, particularly with alcoholism is progressive. It will only get worse if you continue to drink. And a lot of people really struggle with that concept because they're still in that space where I could probably, you know, what if I do dry January? And then I've proven to everyone. That doesn't mean to say, you know, if you spend dry January obsessively thinking about the 1st of February, so something's going on.
Yeah, well, look, Serena, just coming in for this, the first thing I want to say is thank you. Thank you for sharing such an astonishing story. And there will be people tuning in, and there will be senior people in business that will recognize a lot of that. And I like what you're talking about there about recovering loudly so others don't fail quietly.
Yeah.
That's really important, I believe. And just to come back to you in that, because there's a gap for me. There's a gap from when you left rehab,
yes,
and to where you are now. Is that, of course, when some people leave rehab, their addict brain takes over again.
Yeah.
So what has made 8 months sober? What has made the biggest difference in first shifting that mindset when you left rehab, which relates to what you told me, but then focusing on the Serena brain to get on that positive focus and action? Yeah,
it's a great question, and I probably don't have a clean answer for it. I think there's a couple of components. That day 4 experience, it was more than that moment. So first of all, when I suddenly realized how much I'd hidden and how clever and what a liar my addict brain was. And I had this sort of like rush of realization. It was the first time I ever said out loud, oh my God, I am an alcoholic, you know. And to other people sitting around me in rehab, they were like, oh, you know, particularly one guy, he was brilliant sort of in the entertainment industry. He was like, oh, she's got it, darlings, you know. She's finally got it. But I did. And I was like, you know, I am an alcoholic. Realization number 1. Then what happened was for the next 3 consecutive days, I cried relentlessly. And because the horror of the things that I was now seeing, hearing, remembering, or not remembering, the difference in who I was when I was drunk versus who I really am was enormous. I was a pretty terrifying person to be around. And the damage that I've caused, it was then a 3-day sort of almost like a kind of like a mourning for myself, and so many emotions like anger at myself, but also a huge, when I realized it was a sickness. And what came out of those 3 days was just enormous. I talked earlier about my self-loathing being off the charts and how I couldn't look at myself. I couldn't take pictures. If someone tried to take a picture of me, I'd make them delete it. And it's not because I looked bad, because, well, in my view, I did, but I'm pretty good at hair and makeup. So that's always really helped. And it's amazing how many people, because of that, because I speak well and present well, would say, you don't look like an alcoholic, including other alcoholics in rehab. One woman said, do you work here? and then when I sort of explained my story, in her view, binge drinking wasn't a real alcoholic, and maybe I didn't, and all. So it just goes to show there's so much misunderstanding, even with addicts, right? So I had this kind of self-loathing. In those 3 days, I realized that I genuinely did not any longer feel I was deserving of love at all. That's the damage I'd done to myself of years of abuse in terms of my mental health, this double life, this, whatever. I realized that. And then the other big thing that I realized, which changed my real perspective on everything, a therapist who was just genius, and thank goodness we have people like this, they said to me, Serena, you are not a bad person trying to be good. You are a sick person trying to be well. And it changed everything. And from day 4, because of my ADHD brain, one thing ADHD individuals love is if something sparks your interest, a topic, we want to get down a rabbit hole on that. Learning. ADHD is a brilliant learners. We're fast, we're detailed, hit it, give it everything. And I turned up after day 4 to every day with a notebook, and I insisted on writing minimum 2 pages of either quotes from other alcoholics or addicts or a significant piece of learning. I went at it in the evening. I was Googling everything. I looked at YouTube, TikTok. I read I absorbed myself in the nature of this sickness, this disease that I had. From a scientific perspective, there are differences in our physiological makeup. Once you are an alcoholic, your body is different. And, wow, how interesting, tell me more about that. So off I went. And it just, because I'm a fast person and everything I do in life is faster, I was so ready when I left rehab. I was so ready. I didn't want to, before going into rehab, I'd done a couple of interviews for pretty much like-for-like jobs, other big directorship roles, global responsibility. And I did exactly what I would have always done. Mask on, present well, try and smash the interview. I would then leave that interview and be so utterly depressed that my body was screaming, I don't want to do this anymore. And having the time and the space in rehab and the learning, the accelerated learning that I got, I was like, Serena, if not now, then when? When are you going to set up your business? When are you going to focus your attention on the things that you're really good at, you bring a difference to, and you make a difference? And now the gift of these years of addiction and mental health issues and ADHD diagnosis, that's given you something else. And what would have made a difference to me is if somebody like me spoke up in an inspiring way that made it safe for me to say to somebody, you know, my boss, for example, my mental health is really bad at the moment, you know, and I'm worried about my drinking. If I could just say those words, if I could just say it, would I have ended up in that position? Would it have got to such a near-death experience? You know, would the catastrophes have happened? I don't know, but there's a chance it might have been different. And what worries me is my network around addiction and recovery is now enormous. And I've, like I said earlier, some brilliant people, but there is still this stigma and the warnings. You know, some very well-meaning people have even sort of said to me, you know, outside of recovery and in recovery, are you sure, Serena, you want to talk about this on this podcast? I'm also writing a feature article that will come out in November for a magazine called Women in Change. And I tell my story there. And I've had a lot of people, really well-intentioned, are you sure you want to say this? And of course, you know, that I can't pretend there isn't a part of me that isn't worried. You know, I've just launched my own business and now I'm going to tell everyone that I'm an alcoholic in recovery, you know, yikes. But I just can't ignore the fact that I am compelled to recover loudly, because that's how I got well so fast. The gifted therapists, the people that came in and did workshops with us that were addicts and in recovery themselves, who spoke with such intelligence, you know, that's what made the difference.
I couldn't agree more. And again, I have to thank you for sharing so openly here. And I see the benefit of what you're talking about, this recovering loudly, the fact that you've been a senior leader, you've been a global leader, the fact that you've been through addiction, that you're recovering from that, the fact that you can talk so eloquently about it and create safe spaces for others to do so. It's such a benefit for what you're doing now, because there is no doubt from research, even research that I've done, is that the instances of growing mental health issues, anxiety at senior leadership level have grown exponentially over the last few years. And I think that maybe because people are starting to talk more about it. Like you said before, we're more free to talk about that, but not necessarily what goes behind that. Sometimes might be the addiction that keeps us going or whatever that is. So you talked a little bit about this before. So we have a leadership audience, a global leadership audience that tune into this podcast.
Yeah.
For some of them, this will clearly resonate. And if they think deeply, they may recognize themselves in this. So what would you say to those listening who are living with or managing addiction that helps them to A, acknowledge it, but B, start that more positive journey on a different path?
Yeah, and it's a brilliant question. And as I said earlier, pretty much everything I do, I try to do things in simple terms. So I'm going to try and explain this, and it's not to dumb anything down. I just want to be pragmatic about it. So from a maybe substance abuse / alcohol issue perspective, if you have Googled, have I got a drinking problem, or words to that effect, the news you don't want is the answer is probably yes already. So for addicts and alcoholics, because of how we deal with those substances, we forget what normal drinking is. And it used to make me quite angry when I came up against a normal drinker. I'd be like, what's wrong with you? Have another one. You know, I was always pressurizing everyone else, right? These are all signs. If you have forgotten that a normal relationship with alcohol, somebody who was not in an addiction phase, is somebody who does not think about alcohol in their day-to-day life. If they come across it in a pub, or there's a wedding, or there's an event, they may drink. They may drink too much and wish they hadn't, but they are not planning around their drinking. They're not pressurizing others to drink. And they will be able to leave it for any given amount of time. And if they moved off to a desert island, on their I wish I had list, alcohol wouldn't feature. That is a normal relationship. That's a healthy relationship to alcohol, right? So if those things don't apply to you, I would really encourage you to spend some time exploring that and remembering that continuing to drink, if you are already on an addiction pathway, it will only get worse. And so it's never, swapping out wine for beer. If you're doing things like that, my drinking's fine. If only I didn't drink gin anymore, and swapped that out for something else. All of these methodologies, these are all little flags combined may mean you need to take a look at that. So that would be the first thing I'd say. The second thing, without any question, is tell somebody and choose someone, if you possibly can, who either has had an addiction or alcohol issue themselves or exposure to it, and is somebody who you can say to them out loud, I want to tell you something. I don't necessarily want advice, because the greatest fear for an addict brain is you're going to stop it. And that's why people, that's why it doesn't make sense. Addiction behavior doesn't make sense. And that's because your addict brain's in charge. And the last thing that wants is for you to stop it doing. So don't tell anyone, and certainly don't get advice, So find someone safe, if you possibly can, who's maybe had exposure to this in some shape or form, and say it out loud. And the change that makes is quite marked. Once you've said to another human being, and this is really built into recovery process, saying out loud that you're an alcoholic, or that you're worried you may be, or you're concerned about your drinking, whatever you want to phrase it. You can say I'm an enthusiastic drinker with issues, whatever you want to call it. As soon as you allow yourself to say it, something in your brain, not your addict brain, steps forward. And it might take you 10 years from that point, but it starts. And that's super important. The other thing I would say is you really are not alone. And I'll come back to the fact that the hundreds of people I've met in recovery are some of the most amazing people who couldn't be more varied. Every age, every gender, every race and ethnicity, whoever are sitting in those recovery rooms. And the commonality is they get it straight away. And it doesn't matter who you are. And I think remembering that particularly issues around culture and drinking, alcohol is not illegal, and it's coming at us from every angle. It's built into some cultures at work. We know finance and legal have real issues with drinking culture, oil and gas industry also, so there are cultural things that it becomes entrenched and embedded, and it makes it much harder for you to sort of face up to some of those realities. So take a look around you and think about, how much of my life is being consumed about planning and plotting and how to get more time in the pub, the bar, or drinking at home, or whatever it is. How much of your time is being consumed by that? And try to reach out to get help.
Thanks for that. Yeah, and that point about you're not alone is that, and when you're grappling with this, it can feel a very lonely place. I'm sure if you've got your two brains competing against each other, you've got that, like you were talking about before, stigma. You've demonstrated huge vulnerability in one way. You're trying to find the courage to move forward in another. And I'm also guessing, therefore, that there may be others listening who are on an addiction path, but also have ADHD, like you discovered as well.
Yeah.
Would you offer some different advice in that respect, in terms of how that kind of either accentuates it or drives it?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you have an ADHD diagnosis and you also have a parallel addiction pathway, as I said earlier, 60% of late diagnosis ADHDers are in that position. And it could be an addiction to sugar. Likewise, it could be alcohol or drugs, whatever it is. It will be some kind of stimulant. And that is because scientifically we're born with much less dopamine. And so energy management and getting a high become an obsession in an ADHD brain. And that makes it really weirdly complicated, but at the same time, very simple. So once I understood that, I looked at my drinking behavior and I was like, oh my God, okay, so ADHD, Serena, I was getting to a point where drinking was a task to replace the relentless to-do list that lives in my brain and lives in the brain of all ADHDers. So the big misconception is that ADHD individuals are overwhelmed by little things. Not true. It's the opposite. We take on everything, so much so to the point that we then become overwhelmed, unsurprisingly, right? So it's not that we can't do any little pressure. It's the fact that we were already carrying everybody else's and adding to it because we want to get things done. And so I realized my drinking twofold. I was drinking as a task because I love tasks. And I was drinking as a task because it stopped me doing the other tasks. So it gave me peace. It gave me, I don't have to, I can actually have a break from the relentless to-do list. My new job is to drink this and keep drinking. And addict's brain is like, yes, please, and keep drinking until you are blacked out, unconscious, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't know that. I was just like always wishing that I wouldn't get to that point, but inevitably would, So when I understood those two things, I realized I was chasing dopamine. The irony is, for me, when I was drinking, I was never a relaxed, laid back drunk. I couldn't have been more opposite, So I was, even more on an accelerated path. And what I've learned through having an amazing ADHD coach is that if I took substance and alcohol out of that equation, a lot of ADHD individuals are addicted to their hyper-focus stage. And hyper-focus means you're suddenly unstoppable. And you'll find that you're awake until 3 o'clock in the morning and you've got more energy then than you did at 9 o'clock in the morning. And what you achieve in that time is what an army of people would achieve in that time. You're like a superhuman. And you've thought about everything, you've learned stuff, you've been creative, you've done it all. That state of mind, which is a superpower, if you want to use that word, or a gift, that in itself is addictive. So when I'm drunk, I behave like that. And that's the addictive part. And what I've had to learn in my sobriety is how to live with my ADHD self, unregulated, apart from my medication. And my meditation does a lot to help me. But, the pressure I put on myself to launch a business, the pressure I've done, I never do things by halves, obviously. So, bang, 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 hyper-focus. And it was my ADHD coach who said, I inevitably had a crash and burn. And I was like suddenly unable to sort of, I'd done 5 days of 3 hours on average sleep a night. I'd forgotten to wash, eat, drink, sleep. And that's very common in hyper-focused stages of ADHD. If you are out of a schedule, so you're not expected to be in the office or living by anyone else's rules, which I wasn't, because it was just me and setting up a new business, that's what happened. 4 or 5 sustained days of hyper-focus, crash, inability to form a sentence, exhausted, unregulated, what happened here? Well, I spoke to my ADHD coach and she was like, well, what's happened, Serena, is you were not self-medicating. So where with my drinking, I was enforcing days of rest because I'd be so hungover, I couldn't move for 2 days. And although those 2 days were riddled with depression, anxiety, etc., I was also resting. And because I have an inability to relax in the way that society thinks relaxing is, for me, relaxing is just learning. If I'm allowed to just Google everything for 24 hours, I've had a really relaxing day. But, physically, it takes its toll. And, for people listening to this with ADHD symptoms, watch out for addictions around your hyperfocus and when you're really amazing, because God, it feels good and you want more of it. And finding healthy ways to manage it. So I'll drop this in a lot. I love helping people with this tip. A neurotypical person would look at those 5 days of me being an absolute maniac and smelling and starving, but can't stop, and say, what you need is a schedule. And this is exactly what happened. A really good friend came and wrote out a schedule of how a person should live. So, between 6:30 and 7, make coffee, feed the dog, 8 till 9, empty the dishwasher, blah, 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 get showered, get dressed, we're talking like this. And of course, when she left, I looked at her horrible sort of handwriting version. I made a beautiful poster with colours and made it look beautiful and thought about it. And then I put it up on the wall, because this is what a lifetime of being expected to be neurotypical has taught me: just conform. So I put it up on the wall in my kitchen. And then for the next 3 or 4 days, I'd have to do this as I walked past it. Every time I saw it, I felt more of a failure than I've ever felt. Because if I am 1 minute off those timings, I failed, and I'd stop I can't do the rest of the day. And so when I told my ADHD coach, she said, right, you've become addicted to hyperfocus, and get rid of that schedule immediately. And then she told me this: create a menu. And I was like, what? And what? And she was like, Serena, what's the point of that schedule? And I was like, so I can live a normal life. And she's like, no. She was like, so that you can live the life you want to live without hurting yourself and having to crash at the end of it. So what we're trying to do is put things in place that you want to do that help you a bit. And she was like, so one of the things on my friend's schedule was, by the end of the day, I would have drunk 2 liters of water. Well, I can't do it. So she said, okay, why don't you say, have a sip of water and put that on your menu of things I might do. And I'm really wired to find words funny. So I love funny names and strange words, and sip makes me laugh. And she was, as soon as she said, why not have a sip? It's for how she said it. And I was like, oh my God, yeah, I'd love to have a sip, and of course, here I am, I'm sipping water with no expectation to get to 2 liters. Because if you say 2 liters and I can't do any of it, I'll have none, So another thing on my menu is, I talk about this all the time. There's something I've done my entire life without knowing it, which is I go off into a daydream. And my favorite place to do that is in my back garden. I like to stand outside and stare, probably a bit like, with my mouth open. And I go into a total daydream. And that's me processing, filing, drifting, switching off. Just love it. And she was like, well, put that on your menu and never put a time on it. So, it's not 10 minutes. If you go out and say, go and stare for 10 minutes, I'll be watching the clock and forget to stare. She was like, just stare until you feel like you've finished. And then the final thing was, she was like, and by the way, you don't have to write this menu down and you don't have to put it on the wall. If you want to, do it. But why not let it just live in your head? And it does every day. And there are some days better than others. But I do have a sip of water and I do go off and stare and I don't feel bad about it,
What great advice. And just what you need somebody like that who is giving you that. So I've got the most difficult question for you now.
Yeah.
For everybody, for those tuning in, with everything that we've covered. And again, I'd like you to thank you for being so open, because it definitely will resonate with people who are tuning in here. What would be 3 takeaways that you'd like them to take from this discussion?
Yeah. I'm going to start with my big passion. Whatever power, privilege you have, lean into the fact that there are people looking at the numbers. There are people around you who, because of how we have built stigma, are hiding something that they've become ashamed of. And if you have any resources at all to be able to start a conversation, that it could be a conversation about well-being and broad, but building in an element of, and guess what? Human beings also become addicted to stuff, you know? Starting to normalize that could genuinely save somebody's life. And that would be my takeaway one, an absolute plea for building this conversation, expanding the mental health discussions in your business into this, is a real game changer. The second thing I would say is, if you're worried about anything that I've said, if things are feeling uncomfortable, you know, there are so many tools and resources. And, you know, one thing I do offer as well, I partner with ADHD UK, which is a charity, and I offer specifically ADHD and addiction coaching to people on a low income or benefits. So I do a really massively discounted rate there. And that's because this is life-changing stuff, and it shouldn't only be accessible through expensive corporate schemes, you know. So, you know, there are lots of organizations out there to help. I'm more than happy to have a conversation with anybody who may be worried about themselves or someone they know or love or work with, in terms of how to help people. And I'm often asked by leaders, you know, well, what can I do? You know, how do I spot an addict? You know, that kind of stuff. And take that question away. It's, you know, the thing about addiction is, when addicts go into recovery, we learn we don't blame anyone. Nobody's at fault. Your boss, you're anyone. You don't have that responsibility. The only responsibility you have is to make it safe enough for somebody to be able to tell you. That's it. You don't need a special pair of glasses to spot an addict, or you know, what are the signs of? You might know, you might get those feelings, but you know, it has to start with the person who is suffering with the addiction. And finally, in terms of ADHD, this is a weird one, and I've really thought hard about saying this, and I hope it comes out the right way. So there's a lot of stuff on social media about ADHD, and some of it's great and some of it is really unhelpful. And I can't tell you the amount of people I have who come up to me and say, oh, you know, thanks for talking about ADHD. I'm ADHD. I mean, I haven't been diagnosed, but, you know, I put my keys in the fridge and the milk in the car the other day. And, you know, these perhaps they have. But what I would encourage people to do is start, what we associate is a bit old-fashioned with ADHD, and particularly for women and girls. And that's why there is such a rise in late diagnosed women. Sadly, you know, most sort of medical research is done on men for men, and that's, you know, been the case for a long time. So women internalize ADHD. So that hyperactivity that you think about in terms of naughty schoolboys running and jumping and falling out of trees, for women, hyperactivity is in their brain. And they're often the girls at school that are called too chatty or a bit dreamy, you know. I was all of those. And, you know, I've carried those labels for a long time. So I think some of the misunderstandings around ADHD aren't helpful. That's the point I'm trying to make. So if you're curious, do some really good research. And that's where I would definitely point you in the direction of the official charities. You know, there's a lot of them out there, and less TikTok, Instagram, that kind of stuff. Because although some of those things are hilarious, and don't get me wrong, me and my daughter share about 100 TikToks about ADHD a day with each other, But if that's all you think ADHD is, then you're on the wrong track, because undiagnosed ADHD can be catastrophic. So that's kind of where I'd say, if you want to learn more, go to good sources.
Great advice, Serena. Thank you. And what an important conversation we've had. For some listening or even watching this on YouTube, they'll want to reach out to you, find out a little bit more, start a conversation. How do they do that?
Yeah, really easy. So you can find serena.consulting. That's my web address. That's a great place to go. You'll learn more about the different coaching, one-to-one or group coaching I offer, and talent strategy. Alternatively, you can find me on LinkedIn, Serena Consulting or Serena Palmer, either one of those. And I'd be really delighted to have ongoing conversations with people. And let's just break this stigma. What an amazing, life-changing thing that could be.
What a great call to action. Serena Palmer, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine. Please like, comment and support us on your favourite platform, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch as well as listen to each episode.